Hi, we're so happy to be here. We're joining Earth Day 2022, the virtual stage, with Earth Day Initiative and the March for Science, New York City. I'm Maeve Higgins. I'm a co-host of Mothers of Invention, a climate justice podcast with a feminist angle. And today I'm thrilled that I'm joined by Dr. Adelle Thomas. Welcome, Adelle. Thank you so much. I'd love for you to introduce yourself.
Thanks so much, Maeve, and glad to be here. I'm Dr. Adelle Thomas. I go by Adelle, and I'm a climate change researcher. I focus on adaptation and loss and damage.
Great. So, you know what I really wanted to get from you, and this is hard. This is a big question. But you helped to author the IPCC report, the one that came out in March, particularly focused on adaptation. So if you had to summarize that to say, an 8-year-old child or a comedian, how would you summarize it? What are the top things that you want people to know about this report and your work on it?
Yeah, that's a great question. The report is huge. It's over 3,000 pages long, but I think there are 3 key messages. The first is that we are already experiencing climate change impacts. So it's much worse than we thought it was. The second is that these impacts are being experienced by most marginalized communities. So everyone everywhere is not experiencing the same. We have some people that are facing these impacts more seriously, and those are marginalized communities. And then the third sort of key message is that we urgently need to take action before it's too late. So the report is pretty serious in that, we're facing these impacts now, but it does have a hopeful note in that there's still some things that we can do to prevent this from becoming much worse.
Okay, well, thank you for that summary. It's definitely sobering, isn't it? Like when you say that, you all took a look and all of these dozens of experts dug in and you found it worse than you thought. What was worse? What impacts were worse? And also I'd love to ask you about, you mentioned the second big finding, which is not all of us will be affected equally or are being affected equally. So who are the people that are bearing the brunt of it and how are they doing?
Yeah, so some of the impacts that we are already seeing is that we're seeing changes to the environment. So we're seeing, some things like coral reefs or wetlands that are already being destroyed, and it's due to climate change. We're seeing increased water scarcity, so not enough water in some places. We're seeing declines in food security. We're seeing more flooding. We're seeing damages to infrastructure and buildings, and all of this can be related directly to climate change. And so that was a key finding, that we can relate these impacts that we are already experiencing to climate change. And then in terms of some communities facing these more than others, it's low-income households, it's migrant communities, it's women and children, and it's developing countries in general that are facing these impacts more seriously.
Wow, so this is a worldwide study, right? So, because the things you mentioned there, they all sound so different to me, coral reefs or wetlands, right up to, I think the term you used is a decline in food security, which is sort of like a way of saying, people who don't know where their food's going to come from.
Yeah,
because absolutely. Right. And so when you mentioned various communities in various countries, where are they and who are they?
Yeah, so we can think about developing countries or the global south, as we like to call it. So it's places like where I'm from, the Bahamas, lots of different countries in the continent of Africa are experiencing these impacts, in Asia. But not only in these developing countries, but also within places like the US. So if you can think of the hurricane or the storms or the flooding that affect in New York, and you saw whose apartments were being flooded, who actually died from the storm, you can see that it affects those with less income, those that are more marginalized, more than it affects those who have the money or the means to respond to these types of impacts.
Yeah, you're so right. I live in New York, and that was a real tragedy. We lost, I think, 12 New Yorkers in these big storms that happened, and the floods that came that were bigger and wetter. The rains were, and so much water came in, and often it was actually people from migrant communities that died in those floods right here in New York. So, you know, it does come home, as you said, it comes home to all of us, but like in different ways. And so what is the, you know, what are the actions that you think we should be pushing our leaders to take?
Yeah, so absolutely in this report, we stress that there needs to be urgent action now. And so it's urgent action on mitigation. And mitigation means reducing our greenhouse gas emissions.
Right.
And so the critical number is 1.5 degrees. We don't want to exceed 1.5 degrees. We're already at 1.1 degrees. And so we have a lot of work to do to make sure that we don't exceed 1.5. And the second
like,
thing,
it's so, I'm sorry to cut you
go
off,
ahead.
but like 1.1, it sounds so tiny. Like if, you know, from a kind of, you wouldn't even feel that change yourself on your skin. But when we are already seeing these consequences, and it's only changed from 1.1 when we're seeing people drowning in New York City, and we're seeing people from like the breadbasket of Africa where there's now a drought, like these massive changes from such a small, you know, 1.1. So keeping it at 1.5, you think is mitigation is how the best way to do that?
Yeah, so we absolutely need to get to net zero in terms of emissions.
Right.
That's critical. But what the report also says is that in addition to mitigation, we need to adapt. So we need to start making sure that we are responding to these impacts that climate change presents. And we need to make sure that we're providing support for these communities that are already experiencing these impacts.
Right. So it's so important to address that, right? And to say, it's already here, because I think often in kind of the wealthier countries or the global north, there's this sense like it's coming. It's and what you're saying, and you and your colleagues in scientific community, and I'm sure, you know, with your background being from the Bahamas where it's more real day to day, you're saying it's here.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
how are you going to support the people affected, you know? And so how should the world support the people that are affected?
Yeah, so there's lots of stuff that we lay out in the report that can be done, you know, providing support for early warning systems, providing support for communities that may need to relocate somewhere else, you know, responding when there is an extreme event like a flood, rapid assistance right after, helping people with livelihoods like fisheries that may be affected by climate change. We lay out lots of different things that can be done, but what we really stress is that something urgently needs to be done.
Something needs to be done. And like the adaptation part of it is so fascinating to me, because there, you know, I looked at the report. Now I would say I didn't read the whole thing, and my concentration isn't the best because it's been, you know, my brain is wrecked by Instagram. But like I did read it, and it's like, okay, adaptation looks like a lot of different things actually. You know, like you said, if there's like a kind of a just transition from working in one area to then working in another area. Also, migration is a form of adaptation, right?
And so adaptation is very locally specific. So what works in one place may not work in another place.
Right.
Migration in one context may be an option. In another context, people don't want to move, right? So you need to come up with something else besides migration, especially when you start thinking about climate justice or just transitions. You have to take into account, you know, where people want to stay and then figure out what works to make that happen.
Now, Adelle, I love that you brought up climate justice, because that for me is where I went from being a kind of like paralyzed, oh, I wish there was something I could do, to actually saying, oh no, this is what I can do. Like climate justice for me is really where it's at. Could you define that term, like for people who are curious about it?
Sure. So climate justice is a term that's used by different people in different ways.
Yeah, I'd love to hear your,
yeah. For me, climate justice is recognizing that people who have contributed the least to climate change are being affected the most.
Yes.
That we need to support those people, and that those people absolutely need to have a seat at the table when it comes to coming up with solutions to climate change. So it encompasses all of that.
Yeah, I absolutely love your definition, and I'm just 100% behind that. And so when, like, where did you personally arrive at that? You know, you mentioned that you're from the Bahamas, and so do you have personal experience with the kind of chaos that like climate change has wreaked? And are you even comfortable bringing that into it? Because I know you also have like a science background. So where do they meet or not?
Yeah, they absolutely meet. I can remember as a child, you know, with hurricanes and being in the bathroom with my sisters, you know, because that was the safest room in the house when a hurricane came through. To just in 2019, when Hurricane Dorian came to the Bahamas and my grandparents' house was completely destroyed. There's nothing left there.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
So just in my lifetime, like seeing how these storms have intensified, seeing, you know, the very personal impacts that it's had on my friends and family. And that really provides me with motivation to do this type of work. It's incredibly depressing to be a climate change researcher, but it's something that I do because I have the personal connection to it.
Well, you know, I appreciate your work, and I know that all the viewers will too. And obviously you get, you know, a financial reward. There's huge money in being a climate scientist, I'm sure.
I wish there was, probably as much as a comedian.
No, too right. Oh my goodness, touche for sure. I found out that, I mean, you can correct me, but like the IPCC report, it's almost like a voluntary thing, right? Everybody puts in their time and their work as this sort of on a volunteer basis for humanity's sake.
Yeah, so we all voluntarily devoted our time over the past 4 years, many weekends, late nights, early mornings, devoted to this. But we do it because it's such an important message to get out there and really to spur action.
It's a really important message, and it's been powerfully delivered by you here today. And I'm just so thrilled that I got to talk to you, and we got to hear from you, and we got to learn more about climate justice and how crucial that is. And also, of course, about adaptation and about these different impacts of both climate change, and also the impacts that we can have when we push our leaders to take action and to take care of our brothers and sisters around the world, as well as ourselves. So thank you so much for joining us. Do you have any final things that you want to say to everybody on Earth Day today, 2022?
Thanks, Maeve. And I would just like to say that we can each do our part. I think it's really important to put the political pressure so that we do something on a big scale. So you can make a difference through that political pressure to make sure that we act on climate change.
Awesome. Yeah, awesome. Individual power is political power. Thank you so much, Adelle.
Thanks, Maeve.